Welcome to the Future of Life Institute podcast. My name is Gus Docker, and I'm here with Suzy Shepherd. Suzy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You are the winner of the grand prize in our Superintelligence Imagined contest. And this prize was for a short film called Writing Doom. Maybe you tell us a bit about yourself and your film.
Yeah, so I make films. I'm mostly a video editor, freelance, and been doing that for a while now. I mostly do kind of factual documentary-ish stuff most of the time. Did some fiction stuff a while back during uni and kind of haven't dabbled since, but have been kind of wanting to get back into it. Writing Doom is, it's set in a TV show writer's room. Yeah, writer's rooms, people hash out the stories, the overarching stories of the season of a TV show. And so the idea is that so they're writing kind of a speculative fiction, and the idea is that the show is set in 20 years time. So one of the execs is okay, what else is going to happen in the next 20 years? Oh, this weird thing, ASI, maybe that's going to happen. Let's make that the bad guy. Seems great. So these writers get tasked with job of making artificial superintelligence the bad guy for the next season of their show. And they have to just hash out how that would work and what that would mean. And just by, complete coincidence, they've just been joined by a machine learning PhD guy who is, definitely not based on Yudkowsky or anything like that, of course, even though he does write fan fiction technically. But that's just a way to get him in and to get him in conflict with the other characters from the off. And also because we just need a voice of knowing the field and stuff. So yeah, that's the idea. And they sit around and talk about how would this work and what would this mean for the ASI to be the kind of the bad guy, and that kind of springs a bunch of discussion and stuff. But they're always trying to get back to what are our heroes doing, and how does this work as a story?
Yeah, and that is actually one of the first funny moments in the film, where they're discussing whether an artificial superintelligence would be a good villain. Is there something, does this fit into kind of a normal narrative arc where you have the heroes and you have the villains, and is this entertaining to look at? So you end up having the whole film happen within this writer's room. What was that decision like, and how do you think about keeping people's attention when you're not showing anything very action oriented on screen?
Yeah, I knew I wouldn't be able to kind of throw together anything super complicated in the time that I had between finding out about the contest. And so when I came up with that idea, I was like, oh great, we can just do it in in one room and have these characters. The story within a story is always kind of fun thing to play with anyway. In terms of keeping it interesting, there is a interesting film history of films that are just people talking around a table, or I think I saw a film once that was just a guy in a car the whole time, or actually a guy in a coffin one time who'd been buried alive. There is this way of doing a story that is where you just kind of use the audience's minds to fill out the rest of the big showpieces or something. You don't have to always show them exactly what's going on or what you're talking about. Obviously, rewatched 12 Angry Men to prepare, and there's also,
maybe remind our audience what 12 Angry Men is about.
Oh gosh, 12 Angry Men is it's like a set in a jury room, and there's one person of the 12 who thinks that the accused is innocent, and everyone else is completely convinced that he's guilty. And yeah, it's just set in that one room as they discuss, as they figure out, break down their kind of prejudices and why they came to certain conclusions. And it just seems like an open shut case. And then, it's not, because actually what's going on is so human. Everyone has come to that trial and has brought all of their own baggage with them. So it's kind of breaking down everybody's baggage, which is all stories ever do anyway.
I was also reminded of Margin Call from 2011, which is a movie about the financial crisis that happens not in one room, but almost. It's extremely kind of driven by dialogue, and it happens almost entirely in one room, where they're simply talking about events happening in the world. And you're completely right that this is just engaging for people, because people love to hear other people talking, I think.
Yeah, and I think also it's so much easier to get into any kind of story by having a very narrow, seeing a very, very tiny piece of a bigger story, and then using the tiny piece to kind of flesh out the rest. This is what the Iliad does. It's set in this tiny window of 2 weeks, but it's about this 10-year war, right? And you're going backwards and forwards, and you're kind of building out the story in a way that you like feels much more grounded in by just picking like a tiny piece of it. So yeah, and another film that I rewatched was called Mass, which is a fantastic film, which is just 4 people sat around a table like discussing like a really heavy topic. But yeah, would highly recommend that one to people as well, because it's a fantastic, like, yeah, it shows you how fascinating interpersonal dynamics can be, like when there is nothing else going on. It's just those interpersonal dynamics. Like they couldn't depend on literally anything else happening. And yeah, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful film.
So in the film, you handle a bunch of very complex topics like instrumental convergence, artificial superintelligence is the main idea, of course. Agency in artificial agents. Do you think these topics or these ideas are especially difficult to convey if you had to convey them kind of in a traditional film format? It would end up looking like something like Transformers. And do you think having your short film be dialogue driven is a way to avoid that?
Yeah, I think there is this constant tension when you're talking about something like AI, where it's like, it is like, this the first thing you think of is Terminator, and you always kind of risk sounding a little bit crazy. Like, if you talk about the world ending, like, of course you're going to sound a little bit nuts. Like, having a big movie with a big set piece, and it's kind of just like adding to that. And like all of the things that have made me scared about AI are not like watching any big showpiece. It's always been like smart people getting so drawn into the arguments that they start to be like, wait a second, I can't see a way out of this problem. I can't see a way out of this like situation. Like, there's not an easy, like, logical kind of like, oh, this is the reason that we would be fine. Like, and that can be really chilling. It can be really chilling when someone who's like very smart and put together starts to kind of shiver a little bit. It was trying to like replicate that. And also, one of the things that has made me the most worried, I think Yudkowsky went on like a podcast a couple of years ago that went round, and it was just like, it was really scary because he was scared and because he's very smart, and like that, like, I think I actually pulled like a quote or two from that podcast as well, just like shamelessly ripped off random bits from here and there, from TED Talks and from the contest webpage as well. But yeah, so I was just like trying to put in front of other people what would be affecting for me. And I think another element of that, to kind of try to make it affecting for people, is also to like make sure that there's someone in the room who like at least kind of they can relate to in some way. Like, I think a lot of like low budget films, they often lean on like student actors. And then you get like kind of, 3 to 5 people in a room who kind of are from the same kind of, background, the same age, and that kind of thing. And I kind of like, I wanted to make this room have like people of different ages and people coming from very different like angles and perspectives, and like, so that hopefully when people are like, wait, but this thing, I can put that in the mouths of somebody at that table and it will feel like relatable to, that particular part of the audience or something.
And you also, if I'm correct here, you also use that to kind of generate some humor with the differences between generations, and the kind of Gen Z woman talking about being on her phone a lot, and then say the older guy being very skeptical and kind of trying to puncture some hype, or what he perceives as hype throughout the film, and that works very well, I think. So why use humor that much? Because it's maybe precisely because it's such a bleak topic. Is that the reason?
The humor is about like, trying to make it relatable, trying to make these people not seem like, oh, I've gone to a lecture to sit down and like absorb like, information about this thing so that I can do this other thing. Like a random person that I talk to like about AI, like my mom, like, is not going to be like engaging in that in a way of being like, please inform me about like, what could be going on in the world. Like, it's real people talking to other real people that like is more convincing than anything else, or like makes people more open to these ideas.
And they're kind of bringing up objections that will be in the minds of different parts of the target audience. How have you talked to your kind of relatives and friends about AI before? And you wrote to us that some of the motivation for making this short film comes from having conversations where maybe you feel like you weren't really getting through to people on the risk from AI.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a bit nuts when I talk to like someone who like doesn't live in Oxford and like has never like interacted with this stuff before. Like, and actually I really experienced this when I was like sending the script out to the actors. I almost wanted to like put a caveat on the email being like, I know this sounds a bit weird. I know like it, but like, and it's kind of, that has, I think, made me like unreasonably shy about talking to people about it. And like, I think when I have tried, like people have been very like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, sure. Like, what do you want for lunch? Like, fine. Like, so yeah, I really wanted to make something that would be like rewarding for people to watch, even if they came away like with still as little interest in AI afterwards as they had before, right? They've kind of gone on some kind of story. They've like, met these characters that they hopefully kind of like and that kind of thing. So it's kind of, I think the thing about like any kind of factual content, even like documentary, which is obviously very story-based still, is like you sit down and you know that the thing that you're supposed to take away from it is like understanding and information. I think fiction is like can be a bit more sneaky in that way, where like you can just like kind of integrate it in, but like in a way that's like, well, actually if this stuff doesn't matter to you, then you still had like a nice time, or you've still kind of like experienced a story which is like fundamentally like having a conversation with the world or something.
Yeah, or maybe you've learned something about human nature or human relationships that are perhaps too dry or too complex to convey in nonfiction by watching a film or reading a novel. At least that's what I often find, that you can convey something in fiction that's probably difficult to convey in nonfiction while keeping people's attention.
Yeah, and I think it's like it's very tricky as well, because like I'm very conscious that you can make as good a film from a bad intellectual position as from a good intellectual position, right? Often you can make better films from bad intellectual positions. Like it would be way easier to like make a film about how like the US government are lizard people than it would to like make a film about like how they're a mixture of complex personalities and like some people are selfish and some people are trying really hard, and you know what I mean? It's like
just because the true explanation is complex and therefore boring, or what's the general kind of phenomena behind that?
I guess my impression is that like people want the world to work in stories and have like heroes and that kind of thing. And like, this is one of the things that the film talks about, but it makes me cautious of in general, making any kind of fiction film that has like a message, because it just feels like propaganda. Not because I don't believe the things I'm saying or think that I'm trying to manipulate people, but because I know that I could make another film that was about like how AI risk is like not important at all. And I know I could make that film. And so like making this one still feels a bit weird and a bit like ethically dubious or something. Well, not quite that much, but it's something that I kind of feel like, yeah, like fiction can convey ideas, but we've got to be like really careful about like what we then decide to use fiction for.
I mean, I think if you watch your short film and then go to the arguments, there is actually a bunch. We have a bunch of good arguments for AI risk being an important thing to think about, and so I think there's some substance behind the fiction in this case.
Yeah. I just worry that like because there is another version of this film that is intellectually dishonest, it's kind of, you know what I mean? Like you always have to engage in fiction in a slightly like a careful way or something. But yeah, like, yeah, it's of course like very, very, this particular one is very backed up. So I hope.
So sometimes you're conveying a complex topic in one sentence, maybe even kind of like a very short sentence. For example, when you want to discuss the idea that it's difficult to predict how an agent that's smarter than you would outsmart you or win over you in kind of any game of power seeking in the world, you discuss it by talking about, well, if you sit in front of a chess engine like Stockfish, it's easy to understand that you would lose, but it's not easy to understand why you would lose exactly. Because if you could predict moves that it would make, you would kind of be able to win over it. Those kinds of lines you have a bunch of in the film. How do you kind of make sure to capture all of the complexity of an idea in one line?
I do it by stealing things that other people have said. That was directly from, I think, a TED Talk. Maybe Yudkowsky's TED Talk? So yeah, I really can't claim credit for that. I think somewhere in there is a really lovely line that like came straight from like a comment on a forum somewhere that I've now lost track of and can't thank the person whose words it was, but I can presume that people who are engaged enough to like come up with like, good statements about this stuff, like wouldn't mind me borrowing their words. in general, I learned really heavily on other people's understanding. I don't keep on top of all developments in AI. I have like, I have very much like a layman's understanding of it. The reason I was able to write what I wrote was because I was having a lot of conversations with friends who do spend all of their time in that world and, are like very, very engaged in it. And that was like great. And also because like, I read Superintelligence back in like 2018, and then I was like, great, I understand AI now. Great. Now it's just like, and then I came to sit down to write this, and I was like, had one of the characters be like, oh, we can just turn it off. And I was like, maybe we can just turn it off. And like, you know what I mean? I was just like, I suddenly realized that I didn't have as good a grasp on all of the basics as I thought I did. And I just like hadn't engaged really deeply with it for quite a while because I had been around people who actually weren't talking about the basics. They were talking about like, the latest model that had just come out or whatever, and or had all the basics kind of assumed. And then I was like, okay, well, actually, this is a great exercise for me to kind of, get back into a deeper level of understanding, because every time I didn't understand something, like when you're like sat in like a lecture conversation, you kind of, I think it's quite human to be like, not understand a thing, but just like pretend that you do, or like pretend to yourself that you do. But I was finding it's very easy to like put the thing that I don't understand into the mouths of one of the other characters and be like, yeah, but surely that sounds really contrived, or like that sounds really silly. And I would do that and then be like, okay, what's the next line? And then be like, great, I've got to go off and like read a bunch of stuff again. Like, so yeah, it was a really fun way of like re-engaging with that stuff. And I think people talk about this in terms of like, blog posts and stuff. Like if you really want to understand a topic, or just read about it, like write about it and like engage or teach it to people. So I was definitely much more up to date with stuff by the end of writing the script.
It seems like such a valuable exercise to do, to kind of try to explain it to yourself, or explain it well enough that you can convey it simply, because that's not always easy to do. I mean, it's often easier to give a 20-minute rambling explanation than to give a concise 2-minute explanation.
Yeah, and I think this is the other thing when I look back at being the fact that I wasn't very good at talking to friends and family about this. I'm like, well, of course, because I like couldn't remember the basic arguments, like, and they would have been like, why don't we just turn it off? And I'd have been like, well, I think it's like something like this, or but not like gone through this list of like, or like gone into like treacherous turn, or like all the reasons why unpluggability is a thing. It was a really fun exercise. Like I feel like I've now done that exercise, and I can like present this film to people and just be like, here we go, here's the conversation I should have been having with you the whole time, but like, in
an entertaining way also, perhaps, and not just kind of like in a factual way where you're trying to almost kind of inform people. Perhaps there's a resistance, and perhaps it's a healthy resistance to being kind of presented at a topic by another person where that person is trying to inform you. Because, a bunch of people are trying to tell you a bunch of things all the time, and you have to have some kind of filter. But with fiction, it seems like it kind of disarms people a little bit, and you can maybe, it's a gateway to learning something, I think.
Yeah, and I also think that like, stories are a way of like sharing information, but they're just a little bit more like encoded than, like very like literal stuff. But I feel like it's a much more like natural kind of brain feel to be kind of like told a story about, I don't know, a hero who does this, and you kind of learn something a bit more abstract about the world maybe, but you're still kind of building your picture of what the world is and how the world will respond to certain like actions, and like, what the shape of it is. And so I imagine that like stories were used to kind of like convey information like much more in like human history than they are now. But I think they can be it can be a really, really amazing tool.
What kind of feedback did you get? Did you send out the script, or did you screen the film, or how did you collect feedback?
I like wrote the first draft in a massive rush, and then sent it to a friend who's, an AI safety researcher. And like, he went through it with a fine tooth comb and kind of picked out, all these things that I needed to change, but was generally like, yeah, thumbs up. And I made the terrible mistake of being like, great, it's done. It's all accurate and perfect. And also AI safety is a monolithic field and everyone agrees about everything.
Yeah.
And I got so busy with the casting and the organizing and everything else that I then didn't kind of go to anybody else until about a week before we were due to shoot. And I was kind of like, I should probably get someone, at least one other, just in case this first person has like missed anything. And they took a look through it and they were like, I mean, this is great. But like, I think you've missed the main point. And I think without this extra point, like everything you've talked about is kind of interesting, but doesn't really worry me.
And what was that point?
The point was like treacherous turn, which you might notice if you are paying a lot of attention is a little bit more shoehorned into the script than the rest of the stuff, like the explanation about, like small child inherits billion-dollar company, that whole analogy, which is apparently the kind of typical analogy to go to when we're talking about kind of treacherous turn stuff. That's one of like the longer monologues, I think, which is kind of, earlier on I put quite a lot of effort into kind of making sure that it wasn't, well, I mean, it is still a little bit of a lecture from the machine learning guy, I've got to be honest, but like I was trying to, as much as possible, have him like introduce an idea and then have everybody else around the table like play with the idea, like extend the analogy, like, like take it, like understand it quite quickly and then start like making inferences of their own and then like arguing about that and stuff like that. So it wasn't just like, one person like telling everybody else in the room what's what. Yeah, so that was like a super useful to get like another round of feedback just in time. But I think also that comes from a little bit like my first draft was very much kind of drawing on this kind of very classic view of like the kind of, 2014 superintelligence, like all of those kind of old ideas. And then this other person was coming from a very much like modern headspace and like, reacting to like LLMs and how we see the field has like shifted quite a lot. But like, obviously these two things are still integrated. And I think the first person who looked through it was very much like, these are the foundational ideas, even if the kinds of things we talk about now are a little bit different or something. So yeah, I think there is like a little bit of smooshing of those two kind of frameworks together, but like, they are this is the same field. But what I found really interesting as well with the second person who looked through it was that, he picked out a lot of things that the first person had said were great and was like, not really sure. And one of the things that they picked out was a line that I had explicitly copied and pasted from the Superintelligence Imagine Contest webpage that was like a summary of why FLI is worried about AI. And I was just like, I mean, take it up with FLI, dude. Like, what am I going to do? I'm going to leave it in there. Like, they think this. Like, it made it really, really clear to me that like people really disagree on this stuff, obviously, but like also just like the way of expressing things. And there was also, a certain amount of like, they were picking out things that were like, technically inaccurate, but sounded much more like something that somebody would actually say. And at some point, and they were suggesting like, rewordings that were a little bit more like scientifically accurate. And I'm like, yeah, this is starting to sound like a philosophy paper. And we don't, we have to at some point just, for the character and often for the sake of the jokes, let people say something that is like, not really quite the thing, but also like it would make sense for the character to maybe say something along those lines and they're getting the gist of the meaning, even if they're not like, starting to talk like a machine learning PhD kind of thing. So, just little details like, chat GPT wants to be helpful. Like that was picked up and being like, I'm not sure that's really a good way of describing it. And I'm like, yeah, but it's not the machine learning guy who's saying that. Like, although he does agree with this. You know what I mean? There's always going to be this trade-off between like technical language and like, conversational language. And I kind of leaned very hard into the conversational language, I think. And there's like, there's like sometimes the like technical accuracy suffers because of that, but I think it's kind of okay.
I think that's a good choice. I mean, there is this tension about precision or accuracy on one side, and then kind of entertainment value or how quickly you can say something is often also, if you make things very complex to make them very precise and accurate, it will take a while to say something. And that's, you probably lose people, and you maybe you don't even get to convey the idea that you originally wanted to convey because you simply just lose people in the process of explaining something. I think imprecision can be a good tool, especially coming from, say coming from characters that are not the machine learning expert. It works well, I think. What's a character that you thought about including but ended up not including?
Oh man, I think I just wanted like somebody from every like decade of age, like right up from like when I was first like conceiving of the idea. I kind of had this idea of like, okay, well, there's going to be like the person who knows a bunch about this. There's going to be the kind of the authority figure in the room who is the main holdout. And then there has to be some other characters like against whom like these two main characters have their conflict, right? Like kind of all of these like, I don't want to call them intermediary characters because they're obviously like very central to like what's going on, but like the three other characters are the battleground on which like the head writer and the machine learning guy are like having their back and forth, which allows like the head writer character doesn't really have a crazy, like he has much fewer lines than the rest of them. And like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like they don't have to be exactly dagger heads all the time. When I was like trying to think of what are these, where to come from with these other three characters, I was just like, oh, we should do like the different generations, like one for Gen Z, one millennial, one like, kind of more middle-aged person, like maybe a bit older than that. But also like, I would have loved to have like, what's the, the difference between like, how a millennial guy and a millennial girl like interacts with these ideas is going to be a bit different, and also like their interests. Like I had to lump together like, okay, it's like it made sense to lump together like Gen Z is interested in like social justice stuff, sure, but then like you've got like what about the millennials who are super into tech? You have to just like throw as many bits in there for people to cling on to as possible, that there's something in there for people. And I think the other like intention behind those three characters was, how can I try and speak in the language of the audience? Like, so like how, like what makes somebody who's really into social justice more able to understand AI risk than someone who's not? Like, is there a particular part of AI risk that they are likely to get much quicker than somebody who's not into that? And then same again with like, a sensible person who like, is very kind of like very mature and grown up and isn't into kind of like, these crazy things like as different, differently to Gen Z, who's like, of course the world's going to end. And like, and then someone who's like, like, and then you end up with this effect of like, you can rely on that character's backstory to give them kind of a leg up in the understanding, right? So for the character who's really into music, that is his framing on AI. And he's done a bunch of thinking in the past about how music is kind of this like weird arbitrary thing that we love, but we like is not straightforwardly like good for our survival or something, or like, there are kind of ways that's connected to that, but like fundamentally art and music is, it's kind of, we value them for their own sake. And like, he's done a bunch of thinking about that in the past, and then he's like, sees the little connection to AI, and then he suddenly jumps forward in his understanding. And I was trying to kind of find that for all of the characters.
And that makes a lot of sense to me, like thinking about what people already know and then building on that. Yeah, that's hard work that requires a lot of empathy, I think. It's not always obvious what people care about and what people know about. Did you thought about including an elderly person or a child? I'm not sure how this would fit into a writer's room, but there are many elderly people, there are many children, and they might have interesting perspectives or interesting comments, or I could see a child giving his or her perspective and then kind of exposing that perhaps the adults haven't fully thought through what they kind of confidently claim to believe. Something like that. Yeah. Have you thought about including characters like that?
Well, I mean, never work with children and animals, right? Like we we had a lot to like make work about this, and that would have been extraordinarily difficult. But like you say, like, yeah, it would have been great. Like, next time when I have more money, hopefully, to like put into it, like that would be a really interesting perspective. And like, you could probably play with something there around like, the child inheriting the $1 billion company, and like, it's like they're gonna, but also like, they're not the audience I'm mostly trying to talk to, right? Like, so it feels less important to like, get inside the mind of a child, although, the kind of interesting perspectives they might have. And then, like elderly, I guess, like, the head writer character was a little bit older, but like, not like elderly.
Although the head writer strikes me as kind of a different archetype than what I was thinking about with the elderly person. The head writer is kind of competent and knows about the world, and is kind of not interested in new ideas, or at least has some counter arguments for why things might continue to be as they've been throughout his life. Whereas the elderly character could be more scared of change and perhaps kind of overwhelmed by what's happening. But again, I have no idea how you would incorporate something like that. But I think it would be interesting to have something to show to my grandfather, for example, so that he could learn about these ideas.
Yeah, for sure. And like my grandfather is in exactly this position of feeling very out of control and very like scared about things that are happening. And there's a really interesting like angle in this where it's like he knows that he's never gonna get the answers. He's not gonna find out whether we make it. You know what I mean? He's not gonna, and I think that's like such a, I don't know if you've seen the Francis Ford Coppola's latest film.
Yeah, I haven't seen it because the reviews weren't that great, but
It's a crazy film. It's completely, but I was like lucky enough to be at a talk with the director like a week before I saw it. And this is exactly what he was talking about. He was being like, he's 85. He's really scared about the way the world is going and how things are going to kind of pan out. But he has to accept that he's never going to know. And all he can do is like try to talk to the people who are younger than him about trying to find some future to aim for. Right. And so you get kind of like similar vibes from like The Boy and the Heron, which is like Miyazaki's latest film, where he's like, I can't find, an heir. I can't find some like, and I'm really worried about how things are going. And like, kids, it's up to you. It's up to you now. I'm not going to like be here at the end of the story. And yeah, I find that like really kind of fascinating and scary to like, be in that position, I guess.
Yeah, I think lack of kind of continuity in the future is something that older people tend to care a lot about, and thinking about whether what you've built in your family and perhaps in businesses or culturally or something, whether that persists over time, whether there's a legacy there, whether people are maybe remembering you in 50 years or something. And if the world is changing so quickly, perhaps the world is under threat of extinction, well, then there's uncertainty about whether any of that is going to happen. And that is something that worries my grandfather, for example, and some of his friends. Yeah, so those are perspectives you could have included, and I think it's probably good you didn't, because it would have made it too complex. So last character idea maybe is having a skeptic who's also a machine learning expert.
That would have been good.
Do you think it would have made the film too complex again? Because you could easily see, if these two characters are discussing something, you could easily see it venturing into just a complex discussion where the other characters are kind of left behind.
Although you could play with the interesting dynamic of that, kind of both trying to get the room round to their perspective and like both kind of tempted to go into like technobabble to do that, and they end up actually just talking to each other at loggerheads, but then they're kind of like remembering that they have to simplify in order to kind of get the people around them on their side and stuff like that. But yeah, that like, I don't know, I think again, it's a kind of like, it's like a space thing of like how, you can only put so many elements in the room, and also kind of like I mean, I don't know what proportion of machine learning people are scared about this. I get the impression it's quite a few, but like maybe not majority.
It's difficult to get exact numbers here, and it's difficult to know exactly what it is that people say yes to when they cross off on a questionnaire that they worry about extinction risk from AI. But you do have a bunch of prestigious and kind of accomplished academics and industry people worrying about this.
Yeah. I think it would be very tempting to like, have a lot of counter arguments in there that like I think like aren't strong enough or something, just to kind of balance it out, and then for people to come around being like, actually I agreed with the other guy more, which is like obviously like in some ways very intellectually honest, but I don't know, it doesn't like I think there's a lot of voices being like, this is fine, everyone's making a big deal over nothing, and like, in order to like explore the thing that I wanted to say, you kind of have to like, choose an avenue and kind of, and like actually one of the things that came up in the feedback as well was like, maybe you should like nuance this a bit. Like, this guy has to doubt himself also.
Yeah, and now we're talking about the machine learning expert, right? Because he does kind of doubt himself. He is somewhat depressed, and he's talking about whether whether maybe this is all wrong, but I don't see how it could be wrong, and that's kind of his headspace in the end. Not at the very end, but towards the end, yeah.
And yeah, I think there's a line where he's kind of like, the arguments are kind of fuzzy, and like this is something that I was like directly told to put in, because it's just like, like we don't know what we're talking about, like this is all kind of like abstract, and like this is, we don't know, and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think people who are scared of this are not like, this is 100% going to happen, and that like, the people who are saying like it's 99% certain are the outliers. But like, you don't have to be very worried about it to think that there should be way more like resources being put into like looking into this just in case. I think people who are like think that there's like a 10% probability of this happening are some of the people who are like the most engaged with like, like AI safety stuff, because like they're just like, those odds are just like not good, like considering what's at stake relative to like what we're doing and relative to how bad it would be if it happened. Like we are kind of way under investing.
When you think of a movie like Terminator 2. I mean, it's 30 years old, but it's still something that people reach for when they want to have something tangible in their minds to discuss AI risk around. Do you think a short film like yours can help people get other ideas in their minds, or another starting point for discussing these ideas?
I think one big problem is that people don't really watch short films. this is like this kind of really weird thing that's going on in like the filmmaking scene where like everyone and their mums is like trying to make a short film, and then they just like go onto YouTube, and then they just most of the time they just disappear, right? Like this is the thing. Oh, they go to festivals and they get a big stir at festivals, but no, like people don't. Like, I mean, when was the last time you were like, oh, I watched a great short film the other day? Like, you know what I mean? So I kind of think
that is actually true.
I think that's just like part of why it's so hard to use fiction and use film to like talk about this stuff. And like you do have this handful of like important stories that have like changed policy and changed the world. Like you've got like Threads for nuclear stuff, and and also just like, you know, even if you're creating a story that is kind of like exaggerating something or making it slightly ridiculous, it is still creates the idea. Like I can imagine that, you know, people hadn't come across even the concept of artificial intelligence before watching Terminator back 30 years ago. And so there's something to that, although obviously you have to be like kind of careful, you know, get stuck on those particular kind of images and stuff. But yeah, it's kind of, I would love there to be like a feature version, or just like I would love to have something like this in a form that is like something that people typically watch, whatever that means. And if that means like, you know, a 30-second TikTok film, but that's not really going to work. But like, you know,
I think there's an interesting phenomenon happening where you have entertainment either being very short or very long form. So either it's like a 3-hour podcast or a 10-hour TV show, or it's a 10-second kind of short clip. And I think for something like, I mean, your short film could easily be expanded into something much longer, I think. Not easily, it would be hard work, of course, but what I mean is that there's a lot of material to work with, and you could have something like almost like a courtroom drama, but around arguments for and against AI risk, and fold that out into a TV show, or perhaps a feature film.
I mean, if anybody listening wants to fund that, I'm game. I'd love to adapt it. But I think you're right that there is this like strange middle ground where like those, and you know, it's a shame because like short films can be really powerful. You know, I've seen like, you know, like I'm like at film school right now, and I'm seeing a lot of short films, and I'm making a lot of short films, and they can like do things that long form and very, very short form can't do. You know what I mean? Like you can. Like there was one that I saw recently that's just like, you know, you spend time with a couple, like an elderly couple, and one of them has dementia, and like you just like experience their story. And it's not a story that's like worth telling over an hour and a half. And it's not a story that you can tell in like a minute, but it's this beautiful 20-minute piece that like, you know, made me just like cry buckets, you know. And it's like these things are beautiful, but we just don't have like, I don't know, there's not like a natural space for them to sit. So I think often what they are doing in practice in the industry is they are proof of concept for, you know, turning that idea into something else. So yeah, so it's the other thing about like making short films, you always have to kind of go in with that like background knowledge. And I think that's also partly why I've made so few of them, because I watched, when I was like making films on the side of my undergrad course, I watched a bunch of people make really interesting short films and put them on YouTube, and they get like 12 views. And it's like, you know, all of this effort, and like, you know, people should make art, like that's great. But like, I really need some kind of demand in order to like throw myself into something that hard. And it is so hard to make a film. It is so hard, like like trying to make it all come together, like, you know, the number of different elements all have to like cohere, and like it's ridiculous. And like, yeah, the film made before, I just knew there would be like a huge fan base for and a huge demand for. And then this one, I'm like, okay, well, someone's got a context, they want this, like, and I'm like willing to put my own money into it because I'm willing to like gamble on myself, and like, you know, there are these prizes available and stuff. So it's kind of, yeah, it's like making short fiction films is like really weird, and it can be like really demoralizing to like, you know, given that there's not like a natural like feedback loop. And so yeah, that's kind of a difficulty.
Is it simply because people don't want to go to the movie theater or rent for their TV a something that's only 20 minutes long or something? Is it something as simple as that, or is there something? Is there kind of a deeper explanation there?
I think I've heard something like that might be complete nonsense. That's like, like a sleep cycle is like an hour and a half, and this is like a natural kind of like stopping point for films, and you kind of go on this like, it's like a natural like length of time for our brains to kind of like, do a full like cycle of something. Might be complete nonsense. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, and yeah, but honestly, I don't know. I feel like my guess would have been that there would be just this like spectrum of like, we watch short films and we watch medium-length things and we watch long films, and it's just like not how it pans out. And I think you can get all of these like weird artifacts in the way that people behave based on like particular histories of particular mediums and stuff. Again, to go back to classics, sorry. Like one of the most interesting things about like the Iliad and the Odyssey is they are like orders of magnitude longer than any other stories that we even have record of. Like not even that we have, but that we know existed. Like we know that there were some that were like 1,000 lines long. And then you wonder like what was going on when people were going around these like festivals and presumably hearing bards like tell stories. And you've got the one bard over here who's telling like a 10-minute story, and you've got another bard over there who's telling like a 14-hour story. And you're like, how does that change how people are behaving? How does that change? Is there also a person who's telling an hour and a half story? Like, are they trying to make sure that like if somebody walks in halfway through that they still kind of get it, or are they not? Like, you know what I mean? It's kind of, I can imagine like the whole like, 2 hours for a film and then like 10 seconds for TikTok is just like this kind of slightly arbitrary thing that we've got because the two places that we consume media are like, go out to the cinema and do this big thing and like scroll on your phone for like 5 minutes or anything. But then there's like, I don't know, there's like video essays that have converged on like 12 minutes as like a really, really good amount of time. So who knows? It's a mystery. We just have to keep rolling with it, see what we can do.
Yeah, it's interesting to what extent it's kind of a natural versus a cultural phenomenon. Because what is the Odyssey? Is it 14 hours long?
I think Ian McKellen's audiobook of the Odyssey is something like that, 14 hours long. We should look it up.
Yeah, that's a real investment to get into, and especially if we're imagining people kind of 1,000 years ago listening to it and a person kind of speaking it out loud. One guess is that, and this is just drawing from personal experience, whenever I go on YouTube and I find some very good short films, I can watch say 5 of them in the span of a normal movie, and afterwards I feel almost kind of oversaturated, or kind of I have too many ideas because I can't really remember what happened in the first one when I get to the last one, and there's something nicer about having this kind of hour and a half storyline, and you feel like you can kind of get into that and stay on one topic for a little bit longer.
So I've heard people talk about like factual books as being much less about having a book's worth of information to convey and much more about like having one central idea and just needing to come at it from 20 directions, because there are 20 different types of brain that will come at it from 20 different directions, and like you just need time to like gradually absorb that idea and all of the ways that it kind of seeps into the world.
Yeah. Maybe you need to repeat the idea for it to get stuck in people's minds. Or maybe it's more cynical and publishers need a certain length for it to become a real book or something like that.
Maybe. But there's also this thing about like, when people write news articles, there's like the format of news articles is like say the whole story in one sentence, then say the whole story in 2 sentences, then do it in a paragraph. Then, you know what I mean? It's like you're not just like starting a linear like kind of exploration that's at the depth that whoever's writing it has decided is the right one. Like you are having this thing where like, you can in theory tune out at any point in a news article and have gotten the basic ideas.
How did you approach that for your own film for writing Doom? Like, because I'm imagining you want people to kind of get what's happening very quickly, so that they have some kind of knowledge that they then take with them for the rest of the film.
Yeah, I guess this is like mostly done just in terms of like the characters. So like you need to know very early on that like the machine learning guy is like kind of scared, and that the like head writer is
kind of skeptical.
Very skeptical. Yeah. And you just like, I think that there's like a line where they kind of interrupt each other and it's like, yeah, this doesn't work as a bad guy. It's like too easy to defeat. No, it's impossible to defeat.
Yeah, that was funny.
Yeah, I guess this is like the main gist of the thing is like, oh, you are currently in the probably as a viewer, you're probably in the camp of that would be super easy to defeat. We would just turn it off. And oh, there's this other person coming in who's like in this other camp, and this is how far in the other direction it goes. There are some people who think we have no way out. This is just happening. I guess the rest of the thing is just kind of breaking that down and kind of like playing with that, but also given that the kind of point is more to kind of make people aware that there are these arguments as opposed to like, necessarily like getting them to absorb all the arguments. Like, yeah, that line is just like setting the stage.
I have to ask you this. Did you use AI generated kind of assets in the film? I think the poster for the TV show they're writing was seemed a little bit AI generated to me. Is that?
Oh, yeah, it was totally, yeah. AI and Canva, unfortunately, because I was doing all the production design myself on top of everything else. So it wasn't there. And what else? Oh, there's like one line where I like typed into like Claude, like, okay, what would a Gen Z person say to be like, yeah, you go girl, but like in one word? And it was like a slay. And like, great, perfect. And then I like sat down with Mimi, who's like plays that character, and she was just like, oh my God, I read this line and I was like, that is exactly what I would say. That's exactly something I would say. And I'm like, great, cool, nice one, Claude. But I think that was maybe the only like, I think that was the only time. Although actually, I think maybe I also had I don't even notice now how often I like, oh, there's a thing that I like don't quite understand. I'll just go like chat to Claude or chat about it. Like, you know what I mean? It's so integrated now into like, oh, this is a fantastic way to learn really fast, like roughly what's going on in this like field and what's kind of, and obviously like it's a bit risky because there are, but like being able to just like ask exactly the question of the thing I'm not quite getting and then be introduced to like, off the cuff to like, oh, and here's another thing you should probably be thinking about. Like these tools are amazing. Like
much more useful than going to Google and then getting some article that's been optimized for kind of SEO reasons, and it's difficult to find exactly the piece of information you're looking at. If the stakes are high, you have to check what the information you're getting, but it is just a useful tool to have. Do you think you'll use AI more in your production process going forward?
Something that's really, really changed video editing, certainly for me in the last couple of years, is just like all of the AI transcription stuff. Like I now can't edit without having like subtitles on like every interview that I edit. And then if I need to find a thing, I could just read the thing. And like, this is so obvious, but I used to spend so long kind of going back through old interviews being like, I know somewhere they said this really cool thing. And like, and then like making sure to like, label it all as well as I could. And then, but yeah, so when that came into like as an auto feature in Premiere, I think I sped up by like 25% or something on all of my edits, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, so there's like, yeah, I think it's like seeping into various filmmaking-y things.
What about kind of the creative process? What about generating, say, a monster in a film or generating some sci-fi creature? How far do you think AI is, or how close is it to kind of generating the imagery you're seeing?
As far as I can tell, it doesn't write very good stories yet. There's one view on this where like I was listening to a podcast where some like screenwriters, very like old established screenwriters who are very excellent in their job, were talking about AI and AI tools and AI like generated content and all this kind of stuff. And they were like extremely skeptical. They were just like, haha, look at this like story that is written. It's like bad in these particular ways. Or like, look at this dialogue scene that is written like, that doesn't quite sound like a human. And my first reaction was like, oh my God, like it's gotten to the stage of being able to write a bad script, like from zero, like that you're like seeing this like tiny little margin between like, like slightly, subpar script and professional script, and like there being no script, right?
I mean, you have to notice the rate of improvement, not just kind of the absolute performance, because I mean, a cop just in 2020 or in 2018, you couldn't get anything coherent out of large language models, and now you can basically have a conversation with them.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody has predicted that right. I think even the most like optimistic people have been like, out by a way in terms of like how much progress we would make in how much time.
I will say Gwern, the kind of anonymous essay writer, has a great post called The Scaling Hypothesis, where he's very early on predicting some of these things. But yeah, I agree that there are no very obvious kind of experts' predictions that this is the way things would go.
Yeah. I think there's also the other side of that thing as well, where like it might be just like way easier to make progress from zero to bad script than it is to make progress from bad script to good script. Like it might just be that there's something inherent in that like space or something that's like much more work than anything else.
Kind of like it's somewhat it's not easy, but you can get to pretty good self-driving, but there will be edge cases that are difficult to handle, and so you never really get, or it takes a long time to get permission and kind of get fully integrated so you have actual self-driving on the road. And it might be the same, who knows, with writing tasks or with programming or with math or with anything else. That we're kind of approaching expert human performance, but we're not quite there.
Yeah, and I think the way that it will impact like storytelling and fiction won't be like you directly asking it to write a story, right? Like there are a bunch of ways that it can like, make a writer's life easier, even if they're still the ones fundamentally doing the writing, right? So it's kind of like there must be a lot of these like indirect effects, and even if it's just like, tell me about this concept, like I don't want to read the Wikipedia page because I want to understand this very specific element of this thing.
I think that's what's happening now, and I mean, let's hope it stays that way. I think it's kind of a depressing future if the future is just a very large, very general model getting a vague input from a human. Give me a Lord of the Rings 4, and then outputting something kind of a finished product without human involvement. I think it's a happier future if we have more tools and we have kind of enhanced productivity. Perhaps we cut out some of the boring parts of creating something, and you're kind of like a vessel for a vision to come to life, and then you have all of these helpers trying to make that happen.
Yeah, that would be the dream, I guess. And it seems like there's so much that can go wrong there, because like it feels like it's automating away more of the good stuff than the bad stuff. Or like,
is that your feeling at this point because something like transcription, for example, is not really the most interesting part of a process, a creative process?
I guess this like partly comes from like me being like, oh, like to like make art physically is just wonderful. And, I love the images that get created with AI, but it has had a huge like impact on like now fewer people do that nice thing. And like, sure, there's like a bunch of caveats to that. And like, hopefully things will shift around, and like, hopefully people can just do art anyway with the extra time that they get and stuff. But there does sometimes seem like, oh, it's like much more easily kind of automating the stuff that is like inherently like feels good to do or something. But maybe that's wrong. I think also like, human interaction feels amazing, and like that's something that is not going to easily replace or something, although maybe like chatbots and stuff. But yeah.
The order of automation is something I've discussed with a bunch of experts, economists, and so on. And there's, as you mentioned, with kind of the capability gains from scaling and how great these large language models would become. Few people foresaw that, and the same is true of kind of the order of automation. I'm not sure, say in 2010, people would have predicted that you would get kind of very creative AI. People maybe thought that you would get an AI that's great at accounting before an AI that's great at generating art. Although maybe one ray of sunshine is that whenever I see some AI art that just looks amazing to me, it's often some very nerdy person that's been crafting prompts and experimenting with different models and gone through a process. So it's kind of maybe the process is it's still iterative, but it's less like it doesn't take as long, and you generate 100 images, and then you slowly focus in on something that looks great.
Yeah. And the thing that like feels intuitively terrifying to me about that is like, even though it's great and even though I love the results and stuff, is like everyone I know right now is being like, well, I kind of like my job, but I really don't like having a life where I just sit down at a laptop for like 8 hours a day. And like, I mean, this is like a very naive point, but it does feel like everyone's job is becoming that, and everyone kind of hates it, and like we don't really know what to do about it other than like maybe become a digital nomad and then like go to the beach when you don't have to be on your laptop or whatever. But like it's yeah, I don't know. There's something like there are areas of my life where I still have a very like hands-on physical kind of interaction with the world, and those parts of my life feel very like important and fulfilling, and they feel like they're getting kind of harder to do.
There is an argument to be made that the order of automation is going to be something like roughly creative tasks first, then kind of white collar office work, and then last something like care work where you're caring for the sick or the elderly, and you are taking care of children, more physical tasks, being an electrician, being a plumber, something like that. And so perhaps the population as a whole returns to doing something more physical at one point. Although, I mean, I don't know if you've seen progress in humanoid robots, but that's also going pretty well. And perhaps we can kind of adopt the lessons from large language models to teach these robots how to navigate the world in a flexible way, and walk around in new environments and solve new tasks and so on. So
yeah, I mean, at that point, what's left? Like, what do we actually do? Like, I'm sure there are like lots of philosophy books on this, like what happens after work ends.
yes, I mean that will be Nick Bostrom's new book, Deep Utopia, where he discusses that. What do you think we will do? Just what's your intuition here?
Scroll on TikTok. Yeah, I don't know. It feels very scary to me. I can imagine lots of like fun scenarios, and it feels like those feel much less likely than like the hundreds and hundreds of like slightly dystopian ones where we like slowly lose contact with all of the kind of like restorative things that humans need to do in order to like feel good about being in the world. But I feel like I'm getting slightly outside of my area of knowledge here.
No, this is great. What would be examples of restorative activities? Literally touching grass, or kind of being with family, or
Yeah, I think just like hanging out, looking at a fire, seeing the stars, like moving a heavy thing that needs to be moved.
because you feel such a sense of accomplishment once you've moved it.
Yeah, like a friend's boat got in some trouble a few weekends ago, and we spent all afternoon like using a winch to like against a tree, like to like pull it like maybe like 30 feet further up the river to get it into a slightly better mooring spot. And it was great. It was stressful because it was like, oh my goodness, the boat might sink if we don't like do this right. And so like on some level your like moment to moment experience is like, wow, this is like important and stressful. And then the other part of you is like, oh wow, like I'm actually like, look, it's moving, and I did that. Like I did that with my winch. Like this is a 10-ton boat, and I just moved it, and like it's important that I do that. No one else is going to do it for me. Like so, like I kind of I had that day, and I was like, wow, like I don't know how often people get to experience that kind of like deep satisfaction of like doing something that is hard and physical, but also that just like absolutely needs to be done, and that you can see progress, and you like the progress is like meaningful or something.
It sounds a bit like perhaps what maybe the Amish have this, right? That they kind of get together as a community, build a barn together, see the progress over time. But I mean, we have to somehow integrate these desires into a modern world. So it's not obvious how we do that.
Yeah, and it feels like when you know that the physical task you're doing is something that you're doing in order to be doing a physical task, it kind of
now it feels fake. Yeah, suddenly, right?
something breaks. Like it's really.
If you tell me, move this stone just for the fun of it, I'm not really inclined to actually move this heavy stone.
I was like really struck last time I spent time with my grandparents when they were talking about how in the 50s my granny would she would make like these huge vats of chutney, and then she would like put them in jars and then like give them out to the whole street, and she just loved doing it. And that was a situation where like if she hadn't made chutney there wouldn't be chutney, right? Whereas now like, okay, it's cool that we bake bread at home and stuff, but like it feels a little bit harder to like get into the joy of that when you know that there would be bread whether or not you make bread. And so I'm like applying this like chutney framing to everything. I'm looking around and being like, because now it's like she doesn't make chutney anymore because she can just go out and buy chutney and it's perfectly good. And like, I think yeah, I think she misses that a lot.
Is this an instance of our lives becoming too good then? Us becoming too comfortable and there's no risk, and if you don't make the chutney, you just go, you order the chutney and it arrives at your door in no time, and there's never any real risk. But then again, do you really want to create risk for yourself? I mean, we kind of our ancestors have worked very hard to de-risk the world for us and to make us rich and so on.
Right. And I'm sure like also the like on the ground experience of like the people on that street were like, well, this is great. I love this jar of chutney, but I got to make it last 3 months because I can't go to the shop and get one. And they would be like, wouldn't it be great if we could just go to the shop and get one? Like it's such a weird like contradiction. Like I don't know what the answer is other than maybe like have a great time.
Do you plan on working more on AI related topics? What are your future plans for your films?
I mean, I would love to. I like I said, I need like some kind of demand, you know what I mean? Like some like intuition that like, I mean, for both this one and the other like big student film I made, like I had this really strong intuition that if I didn't make it, nobody would make it. And again, it comes back to this thing we were just talking about, right? Like it's like I felt like it would kind of actually do something. But then as a result of that, I've made, there's been a 7-year gap between the last fiction film I made and this one. Like, it's like been doing other stuff in the meantime, but like, and I also distinctly remember like, reading a lot about AI stuff back in like 2017, 2018, like first really becoming immersed in it and being like, cool, like what can I offer to this like field? Like, okay, maybe I should be making like films about AI.
As a last question, perhaps we could talk a little bit about kind of how you're navigating the changes we see with AI in the future. You've mentioned you've been thinking about this for, say, since 2017, and you've made this film. So I know that you know these concepts. How are you navigating all that?
Yeah, I think my like worry about it is like quite compartmentalized or something. Like, when I listened to that podcast a few years ago that went around, the Yukaski one, like I got like very like viscerally afraid, and that lasted like a couple of days, and then I was like kind of fine again. And like, you know what I mean? It's kind of like you can maintain this kind of background like intellectual worry, but like I don't feel like I personally can kind of like experience that in a bodily way for very long. So it's, I don't know. I'm worried about it in some sense, and in another sense, I'm just like gonna just go do stuff, and it's kind of fine. And like, although I thought it was interesting, like one thing that made me much more scared about autonomous weapons was FLI's Slaughterbots film, which is again like a fiction thing, and just made it real and made it visceral in a way that like, and I was like, okay, well, if I read something that says like, oh, this is much less of a problem than like engineered pandemics or something, I would still feel more afraid of autonomous weapons than of like engineered pandemics. So it's kind of like I'm like, I think my actual like experience of like worry is not like really strongly connected to what I think is going to happen, or like where I'm coming from an intellectual position. And but also, I'm also not as much out of a doomer as the guy in the film is, to be clear. Like, I mean, I haven't like figured out exactly what percentage chance I put on this, but like, I'm not at the stage where I'm like, oh, it's 100% likely to happen, and we should just like all go and have parties for like the next couple of years, and then like, everyone should like max out their credit cards or anything like that. Like, I have a lot of doubt and a lot of uncertainty about like how I should be thinking about this, or like what, how likely it is or whatever. So like, I think that creates a lot of distance as well. So I'm doing fine.
Makes sense to me. Suzy, thanks for chatting with me. It's been great.
Oh, it's been really lovely to chat. Thanks for having me on.